The silence was wrong. That was the first thing he noticed. Not the cold, not the ache in his bones, but the quiet. After 30 years carving a life out of the Wyoming dirt, Samuel Hayes knew the sounds of the dawn. He knew the soft lowing of cattle, the rustle of sagebrush, the lonely howl of a coyote saying goodbye to the moon. But this morning was different. The air was dead, still, like the world was holding its breath. He pulled the reins, and his mare, Copper, stopped instantly. Her ears twitched, her eyes wide. She felt it too. Something was out there. Something that didn't belong. His hand, calloused and scarred from decades of work, fell to the cold steel of the Colt, 45 at his hip. It was a reflex, an old habit from a time when survival meant being faster than the other guy. He'd built this ranch from nothing. 40 head of cattle turned into 300. This land was his. Every rock, every blade of grass paid for in sweat and blood. And he'd be damned if he was going to lose it. He nudged Copper forward, up the last rise that overlooked the northern pasture. The cattle should have been there, spread out, grazing, peaceful. They were there, but they weren't peaceful. Samuel's blood ran cold. They were huddled together, a tight, nervous ball of hide and horn, their eyes rolling white with fear. They weren't grazing. They were trapped, guarded. And that's when he saw her. In the center of it all, a figure, small, still as a stone, stood a young woman, an Indian girl. Long black hair, a simple buckskin dress. She had her back to him, perfectly motionless, as if she'd grown from the very earth she stood on. His mind flashed through the possibilities. Rustlers, a raiding party. The Indian wars had left deep, jagged scars on this land, and trust was a currency scarcer than gold. This girl could be a scout, a decoy, the calm before the storm. He urged Copper down the slope, his thumb resting on the hammer of his pistol. Every instinct screamed at him. Danger, trap, get ready to fight. But the closer he got, the more the picture felt wrong. The cattle weren't scared of her. They were calmed by her. They moved around her with a strange gentleness. Some of them so close she could have reached out and touched their horns. It made no sense. Cattle spooked easy. A stranger, especially one on foot, should have sent them scattering to the far corners of the territory. He reined in about 50 yards out, close enough to be heard, far enough to draw. His voice was a gravelly bark, shaped by years of yelling over wind and stampedes. "You there! What are you doing with my herd?" The girl turned, slowly, gracefully, like she'd been waiting for him. Her face was all sharp angles and high cheekbones, but it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were dark, ancient. They looked at him not with fear, but with a kind of knowing that made the hair on his neck stand up. It felt like she was looking straight through his skin, into the dark, dusty corners of his soul where he kept his secrets buried. Her voice, when she spoke, was like clear water running over smooth stones. English, almost perfect. "Your cattle were frightened," she said. That was it. No explanation. No excuse. Just a simple, impossible statement. Samuel's grip on his pistol tightened. "Frightened of what?" he growled, his eyes scanning the horizon, looking for the threat he couldn't see. She looked at him, and that unnerving calm never left her face. "Wolves," she said. "A pack came down from the mountains. They were hungry." Wolves. He'd lost cattle to wolves before. A big pack could cripple him, wipe out a year's profit in a single night of slaughter. He scanned the ground looking for tracks, for blood, for any sign of a fight. He saw nothing. "You expect me to believe you, a lone girl on foot, stood off a wolf pack?" He scoffed. The story was absurd, a lie to cover for something else. Without another word, she turned and walked to the edge of the pasture, near the creek bed where the earth was soft. She pointed. Samuel dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud as he walked over. He looked down, and his breath caught in his throat. Wolf prints. Dozens of them. They circled the pasture, a clear, deadly line where the pack had prowled, testing the herd. But there was something else. The prints were huge, bigger than any wolf he'd ever seen, and among them, something else. A single, bare footprint. Hers, placed deliberately between the wolves and his cattle. It looked like she hadn't fought them. It looked like she had dared them. They tried to attack twice, she said, her voice still impossibly calm. I sang to the cattle to keep them from scattering. The wolves do not like the songs. He looked from the massive tracks back to her small, almost fragile frame. None of this made sense. A girl singing to a herd of terrified cattle while a pack of monster wolves circled in the dark? It was the stuff of campfire tales, of legends. Who are you? He asked, his voice softer now. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling curiosity. I am called Ayana, she said. Well, Ayana, he said, straightening up. Seems I owe you. Those wolves, they could have ruined me. She just nodded, as if saving a man's livelihood was nothing more than a simple courtesy. I was passing through. It was the right thing to do. Passing through to where? He asked, looking around at the endless, empty prairie. There was nothing for 50 miles in any direction, nothing but rock and sky. To the fort, she said. I seek work as a translator. The fort, a hard 3-day ride over the most brutal country in the territory, and she was doing it alone, on foot. It was a suicide mission. That's dangerous country, he said, stating the obvious, especially for... He trailed off, not wanting to say a woman alone. I am not afraid, she said simply. I have been taking care of myself for a long time. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and he believed her. But something inside him, a part of him he thought had died long ago, wouldn't let him just watch her walk off into that wilderness. He'd seen what this land did to people who weren't prepared. The fort's a long walk, he said, choosing his words carefully. You help me get these cattle back to the home pasture, and I'll give you a horse and supplies. She studied his face for a long moment, her dark eyes searching for the angle, the hidden price. He'd seen that look before. It was the look of someone who'd learned the hard way that nothing in this world was free. Finally, she nodded. That is a fair trade. Fair enough, he said, a small, weary smile touching his lips. Let's get to work. As they moved the herd, he watched her. She was a natural. She moved with a silent grace, anticipating the cattle's movements before they even happened. She didn't need to shout or whip. She just needed to be there, and the animals seemed to understand. It was like she was speaking a language they all knew, a language he'd never be able to learn. The sun beat down on them, hot and relentless. But she never complained, never slowed. She just worked, her focus absolute. By midday, the herd was safe in the home pasture. He offered her a meal, and she accepted with that same quiet dignity. Inside the small, rough-hewn ranch house, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. He asked her about her life, trying to piece together the puzzle of who she was. She told him her mother had been captured by settlers as a child, learning English before escaping back to her people. She told him her father had died fighting the cavalry. She spoke of it all with a flat, detached calm, as if reciting someone else's history. There was a mountain of pain behind those eyes, but she'd walled it off, brick by solid brick. After they ate, he went to the barn and saddled up Buck, a steady sorrel gelding. He packed saddlebags with food, a canteen of water, a warm blanket, and a handful of silver dollars. He found himself taking his time, drawing out the task. He didn't want her to leave. Her presence had stirred something in the dusty silence of his life. He led the horse out into the yard. Buck's a good horse, he said, handing her the reins. He'll see you to the fort. She ran a hand down the horse's neck, a silent communication passing between them. As she swung herself into the saddle, a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness hit him, catching him completely by surprise. Ayana, he said, the word coming out rougher than he intended. She looked down at him, her face unreadable in the harsh afternoon light. If they don't work out at the fort, he stammered, feeling like a fool. You're welcome back here. I could always use another hand. She held his gaze for a long moment. That is a kind offer, Samuel Hayes. A cold chill went down his spine. He froze. His hand was still on the horse's bridle. How did you know my name? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. He had never told her. Not once. A small, mysterious smile touched her lips for the first time. It didn't reach her eyes. "The wolves told me," she said, and with that she turned the horse and rode away, leaving him standing alone in the dust, the world tilting on its axis. The silence that rushed back in to fill the space she left was no longer empty. It was filled with questions and a creeping, chilling dread. Days turned into a week turned into two. The ranch was quiet again, but it wasn't the same. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper her name. Every shadow seemed to hold her shape. Samuel tried to lose himself in the work, repairing fences, branding new calves, but his mind kept replaying that last moment. The wolves told me. It was impossible. A joke. A clever guess. But the more he thought about it, the less he believed that. There was nothing clever or funny about Ayana. She was as serious as a heart attack. He remembered the look in her eyes, the unnerving certainty. He remembered the massive, unnatural wolf prints, the way the cattle obeyed her without a sound. He started sleeping poorly. Old memories, ghosts he'd thought long buried, began to stir in his sleep. He dreamed of fire, of smoke, of a raid on a village a lifetime ago when he was young and wore a different uniform. He dreamed of a promise made to a dying Cheyenne chief, a promise he had failed to keep. One night he woke up in a cold sweat, the chief's face burning in his mind. He stumbled out of his bunk and lit a lamp, his hands shaking. He went to an old locked chest in the corner of the room, a chest he hadn't opened in 20 years. The key was hidden under a loose floorboard. With trembling fingers, he unlocked it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were the relics of his former life. A faded blue cavalry jacket, a tarnished medal, and at the bottom a small beaded pouch. He pulled it out. The beadwork was intricate, beautiful, and in the center was a specific symbol, a spiraling blossom, an eternal flower. He'd seen that symbol before, recently. His blood turned to ice. It had been on Ayana's dress, woven into the cuff. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but now seeing it again, it was a clan symbol, the mark of the chief he had betrayed. She hadn't been passing through. She hadn't stumbled upon his ranch by accident. She had come for him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't about saving cattle. This was a reckoning. For 20 years, he'd been hiding out here, trying to wash the blood off his hands by working the land, trying to build something good to balance out the bad. He'd thought he had escaped his past, but the past had found him. What did she want? Revenge? Was she the daughter of the chief? His granddaughter? Was this whole thing an elaborate trap, a way to gain his trust before slitting his throat in the night? He paced the small cabin like a caged animal, the .45 now a permanent weight on his hip. Every creak of the floorboards, every howl of a distant coyote sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was a man under siege, but the enemy was a ghost. The waiting was the worst part. He knew she would be back. Her mission wasn't finished. The horse and supplies he'd given her weren't a gift. They were a tool she needed for the next part of her plan. What was it? Would she return with warriors? Burn him out? He thought about running, packing up what he could and disappearing again. But where would he go? This ranch was all he had. It was the only identity he'd known for half his life. And some stubborn, weary part of him was tired of running. If a reckoning was coming, then let it come. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of blood and fire, he saw a rider, a lone figure on the ridge, silhouetted against the dying light. It was her. She was riding Buck, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, at a respectful distance, rode another figure, an old man, his hair long and silver, his back straight as an arrow in the saddle. An elder. Samuel's hand went to his gun. This was it, the confrontation he'd been dreading. He stepped out onto the porch, his feet planted wide, his face a grim mask. He would not die cowering in his own home. They rode into the yard and dismounted. Ayana's face was as calm and unreadable as ever. The old man, however, looked at Samuel with eyes that held the weight of a century of sorrow and wisdom. He looked at the ranch, at the healthy cattle in the pasture, at the solid house Samuel had built with his own two hands. "You are Samuel Hayes," the elder said. It was not a question. His voice was deep and resonant, like the rolling of distant thunder. "I am," Samuel said, his voice tight. What do you want here? The old man ignored the question. He looked at Ayana. You were right, child. The spirits of the land have healed him. His hands are clean. Samuel stared at them, confused. Healed him? Clean hands? What were they talking about? Ayana finally spoke, her gaze locked on Samuel's. I did not come for revenge, Samuel Hayes. I came to see the man my grandfather spoke of on his deathbed. Her grandfather, the chief. He told me of a young soldier with honest eyes who swore an oath, Ayana continued, her voice unwavering. An oath to protect his people's sacred lands, to ensure they were never driven from the valley of the sleeping giant. Samuel's mind reeled. The valley of the sleeping giant. That's what the Cheyenne called this place. He hadn't known. He'd just seen good water and rich grass. Your grandfather. He made me swear, Samuel whispered, the memory flooding back. The burning village, the dying chief grasping his arm. Swear to me, soldier. Swear that you will be its guardian. He'd sworn the oath just to comfort a dying man. He never thought it was real. He'd left the army a month later, disgusted by the pointless violence, and had wandered for years before finding his way back here, drawn by a memory of a beautiful, untouched valley. He never made the connection. The oath was a prophecy, the elder said, his voice softening. A vision. He saw that one day a great evil would come for this land, a man of paper and greed, and he saw that the only one who could stand against him was the soldier with the haunted eyes, a man who understood both our world and the white man's world, a man of paper and greed. Samuel felt a new kind of chill run down his spine, one that had nothing to do with old ghosts. What are you talking about? Samuel asked. My name is Black Kettle, the elder said. I am the brother of the chief you knew. We have watched you for years, Samuel Hayes. We have seen you work this land. You do not poison it. You honor it. You have become the guardian my brother foretold. He was being watched for years. The thought was deeply unsettling. He had craved solitude, but he had never truly been alone. The wolves, Ayana said, finally answering the question that had been tormenting him for weeks. They were a test, to see if your heart was still true, to see if you were worthy of the oath you swore. They were not wolves of the wild. They were spirits, messengers. They told me you were a good man, but a man who lived in a prison of his own past. My task was to see if you could be freed. So it wasn't a trap. It was an audition, a trial, for a job he didn't even know he had. And now, Black Kettle said, his eyes turning serious, the time of the prophecy is here. The man of paper and greed has come. He is a government man from the East. His name is Crawford. Crawford, Samuel knew the name, a territorial official, a man known for his ambition and his ruthlessness, buying up land claims for pennies on the dollar, pushing settlers and natives alike out of his way. He wants this valley, Black Kettle continued. He has a piece of paper, a government grant, that he claims gives him ownership of it all. He is coming soon to remove you, and then he will bring his machines to tear the heart out of the mountain that overlooked the valley, the sleeping giant. Suddenly it all clicked into place. The urgency, the test. They weren't here to punish him for the past. They were here to recruit him for the future. So you need my help, Samuel said, the words feeling heavy and strange in his mouth. You need my gun, my name on a deed. We need the guardian, Ayana corrected him softly. We need the man who swore an oath. Samuel looked from her face to the old chief's. He looked at the ranch he had poured his life into. He had come here to hide from the world, to be left alone. But the world had followed him. He could run again, or he could stand and fight, not just for his land, but for the promise he had made to a dying man 20 years ago. He let out a long, slow breath, the tension draining out of him, replaced by a weary, grim resolve. All right, he said, his voice low but firm. Tell me everything you know about this man Crawford. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Black Kettle returned to his people, promising to send word if Crawford made a move on the reservation lands that bordered the valley. Ayana stayed. Her presence transformed the ranch. She was no longer a mysterious stranger, a potential threat. She was an ally, a partner. But it was more than that. The house, which had always been just a shelter from the wind and rain, started to feel like a home. They fell into an easy rhythm, working from sunup to sundown, securing the cattle, reinforcing fences, planning. He learned more about her life. She was an orphan, raised by her uncle, Black Kettle. She had been trained since she was a girl for this very task. She was a spirit talker, a bridge between the world of men and the world of nature. The story about her singing to the cattle wasn't just a story. She truly had a connection to the animals, to the land itself that Samuel could only watch in awe. He found himself watching her constantly, the way she moved with such purpose, the way her eyes would light up when she talked about the history of her people, the quiet strength that radiated from her. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 20 years began to recede, replaced by a feeling he couldn't quite name. It was terrifying. And it was wonderful. One evening they were sitting on the porch, cleaning their rifles as the stars began to appear in the vast, velvet sky. The air was cool and clean. "You never asked," she said, her voice soft in the twilight. "Why you? Why did my grandfather choose a white soldier to be the guardian?" Samuel stopped what he was doing. He'd wondered the same thing 1,000 times. "I don't know," he admitted. "He was dying. Maybe he was just delirious." "No," she said, shaking her head. "He saw something in you. He said you had the heart of a warrior, but the soul of a farmer. You fight only to protect what you grow. That is the way of a true guardian." He looked down at his calloused hands. A warrior's heart and a farmer's soul. Maybe the old chief had seen him more clearly than he'd ever seen himself. "I'm not the man I was back then, Ayanna," he said, his voice heavy with old regrets. "I did things, things I'm not proud of." "The past is a river that flows behind us," she said, her eyes meeting his in the gathering dark. "You cannot change its course. You can only choose which way you face as you stand on the bank today." He held her gaze, and in that moment, something shifted between them. The space between them crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with prophecies or government officials. It was something older, more powerful. He saw not just an ally, but a woman, a strong, beautiful, incredible woman. And he felt the walls he'd built around his heart begin to crumble. The warning came a week later, a young rider from Black Kettle's village, his horse lathered in sweat. Crawford was on the move. He wasn't coming alone. He had a dozen hired guns with him, and a territorial marshal waving a freshly signed eviction notice. They were 2 days out. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up Samuel's throat, but he pushed it down. He looked at Ayanna. Her face was calm, her eyes focused. She was not afraid, and seeing her strength gave him strength. 2 days, he said. Let's make them count. They worked feverishly. They moved the entire herd into the high, narrow canyon behind the ranch, a place that was easily defended. They boarded up the windows of the house, leaving only small slits for rifles. They filled every barrel and bucket with water. They stockpiled ammunition. The ranch became a fortress. On the evening of the second day, as the sun set, they stood together on the porch, watching the trail. The fortress was ready, but it was just the two of them against more than a dozen men. The odds were impossible. "Samuel," Ayanna said, her voice quiet, "there is more than one way to fight a battle. Not all weapons are made of steel." "What do you mean, Ichori Ridimanchi?" he asked. "This land is our strongest ally," she said. "It will fight for us if we ask it to." He didn't understand what she was talking about, but he was starting to learn that the world was much larger and more mysterious than he had ever imagined. He just nodded. "I trust you." The trust he placed in that statement was absolute. He was putting his life, his home, everything he had built, in the hands of this woman and her strange, ancient ways. They didn't have to wait long. As dusk settled, they saw them. A column of riders, dark shapes moving against the twilight. Crawford was at the front, a portly man in a city suit, looking ridiculous on a horse. Behind him were his hired guns, rough men with cold eyes and rifles held at the ready. They stopped just outside of rifle range, a clear line drawn in the dirt. "Samuel Hayes!" Crawford's voice was reedy and arrogant. "I have a lawful order from the territorial government for your eviction. You are trespassing on property belonging to the Great Western Development Company. Lay down your arms and vacate the premises immediately." Samuel stepped forward, his Winchester held loosely in his hands. "This is my land, Crawford. I have a deed, signed and sealed 20 years ago." "Your deed is worthless," Crawford shouted, waving a piece of paper. "Superseded by federal grant. You have 1 hour to comply, or we will remove you by force." The hired guns spread out, taking up positions. It was a classic siege tactic. They would surround him, cut him off, and wait for him to run out of food, water, or courage. Samuel looked at Ayanna. 1 hour. She smiled, a small, fierce smile. He is an impatient man. He will not wait an hour. She was right. The sun had barely slipped below the horizon when the first shot rang out. A bullet splintered the wood of the porch railing, inches from Samuel's head. The battle for the Valley of the Sleeping Giant had begun. The night exploded into a chaotic symphony of sound and fury. Gunshots echoed off the canyon walls, flashes of orange light stabbing through the darkness. Samuel was a good shot, and from the cover of the house, he and Ayanna could hold them off. But they couldn't keep it up forever. They were outnumbered, outgunned. It was a battle of attrition they were destined to lose. Crawford's men were professionals. They didn't charge recklessly. They used the terrain, moving from rock to rock, getting ever closer. Samuel and Ayanna fired sparingly, making every shot count, trying to conserve their precious ammunition. Hours crawled by. The moon rose high in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the battlefield. Around midnight, there was a lull in the fighting. "They're planning something," Samuel whispered, peering through a slit in the boards. "They're going to try to burn us out," Ayanna said. Her voice was steady, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "It's what they always do." As if on cue, they saw a flicker of light from the direction of the barn. A torch. One of the gunmen was making a run for it, keeping low, heading for the dry wood of the barn wall. If the barn went up, the fire would spread to the house in minutes. It would be over. Samuel raised his Winchester, took aim, but the man was moving too fast, weaving through the shadows. It was an impossible shot. "I can't get a clear shot," he hissed. "Wait," Ayanna said, her hand on his arm. She closed her eyes. Her lips moved, but she made no sound. She was concentrating, listening. And then a new sound entered the night, a low growl. It started soft, then grew louder, deeper, coming from the rocks near where the gunman was hiding. It wasn't the sound of a coyote or a wolf. It was bigger, heavier. The gunman froze. He looked around wildly, his torchlight dancing across the rocks. The growl came again, closer this time, ending in a rumbling snarl that seemed to shake the very ground. A massive, dark shape rose up from behind a boulder. A bear, a grizzly, bigger than any Samuel had ever seen. It reared up on its hind legs, its form silhouetted against the moon, a monster from a nightmare. It let out a roar that ripped through the night, a sound of pure, primal rage. The gunman screamed. It was a high, thin sound of absolute terror. He dropped the torch and ran, scrambling blindly back the way he came. The bear dropped to all fours and simply watched him go, then melted back into the shadows as if it had never been there. Samuel lowered his rifle, his knuckles white. He looked at Ayanna. Her eyes were still closed, a sheen of sweat on her forehead. "How?" he breathed, the word getting stuck in his throat. She opened her eyes. They looked tired, but they were shining. "The land is fighting for us," she whispered. The attack on the barn had failed, but Crawford wasn't giving up. The rest of the night was filled with sporadic gunfire, the hired guns trying to keep them awake, wear them down. By dawn, they were both exhausted, their ears ringing. As the first light of morning touched the sky, a new sound began, a low, rhythmic chanting coming from the hills behind the ranch. Samuel looked at Ayanna, a question in his eyes. She smiled. "Black Kettle." On the ridge, figures appeared, dozens of them, Cheyenne warriors, their faces painted for battle, armed with rifles and bows. They didn't charge. They simply stood there, a silent, menacing line, watching the hired guns below. Crawford's men saw them. A nervous murmur ran through their ranks. They had signed up to fight one old rancher and a girl, not the entire Cheyenne nation. Their morale, already shaken by the bear, began to crumble. Crawford was furious. He rode out into the open, shaking his fist at the ridge. "This is government business. You savages have no right to interfere." No one on the ridge moved. They just watched. The silence was more intimidating than any war cry. The standoff lasted for an hour. Crawford raged, threatened, and pleaded. But his hired guns were starting to slip away, one by one, melting back into the prairie. They weren't being paid enough to die in an Indian war. Finally, only Crawford and the territorial marshal were left, defeated, humiliated. Crawford looked at the ranch house, his face purple with rage. "This isn't over, Hayes. I'll be back. I'll bring the whole damn army." He spun his horse around and rode off, the marshal following close behind. The warriors on the ridge watched them go. Then as one, they turned and disappeared back into the hills. The silence that descended on the valley was profound. It was over. They had won. Samuel stumbled out onto the porch, his body aching, his mind numb. He looked at the bullet holes, the shattered wood. He looked at the hills where the warriors had been. He looked at Ayanna, who was standing beside him, her face serene. He was overwhelmed by a wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. Gratitude, awe, and something else. Something deep and undeniable. He turned to her, and the words came out before he could stop them. "Ayanna." She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his. He didn't have the words to explain the storm inside him, so he did the only thing he could. He reached out, his hands finding her waist, and he pulled her to him. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hungry. It was a kiss that said, "Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for saving my soul." It was a kiss that poured 20 years of loneliness and regret into one single, explosive moment. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, the world spinning around them. "This is complicated," he managed to say. "No," she whispered, her hand coming up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the weary lines around his eyes. "It's simple. A guardian should not have to stand alone." In that moment, standing on the porch of his battered ranch, with the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air, Samuel Hayes knew two things with absolute certainty. First, his life of hiding was over. Second, he was hopelessly, completely in love. The fight was won, but they both knew the war wasn't over. Crawford was a man driven by greed and ego. He wouldn't accept defeat. He would be back, and next time, he would bring more than hired guns. He would bring the full, crushing weight of the law, twisted to serve his own purposes. They had bought themselves time, nothing more. In the weeks that followed, the ranch became a different kind of fortress. It became a bridge. Black Kettle and other elders would visit, sitting around Samuel's table, drinking his coffee, and planning. They spoke of treaties and territorial laws, of petitions and protests. Samuel, who had spent half his life avoiding both the government and the natives, now found himself at the center of their conflict, a translator not of language, but of culture. He learned the true scope of Crawford's plan. The mining operation was just the beginning. Crawford's Great Western Development Company planned to build a railroad spur through the valley, dam the river, and sell the water rights to the sprawling ranches downstream. It was a plan that would not only desecrate the Cheyenne sacred land, but would also destroy the delicate ecosystem that sustained everyone in the region, settler and native alike. The fight for his small ranch had become a fight for the future of the entire territory. During this time, his bond with Ayanna deepened into something solid and unbreakable. They were partners in every sense of the word. They worked together, ate together, planned together, and at night they would sit on the porch, talking for hours under the stars, sharing stories of their past, dreams for a future they weren't even sure they would have. He told her everything, about the raid, about his shame, about the years he spent wandering, trying to outrun his own shadow. She listened without judgment, her presence a silent, healing balm on his old wounds. She, in turn, told him about her own lonely childhood, the burden of her destiny, the feeling of being caught between two worlds. They were two solitary souls who had found their other half in the most unlikely of circumstances. The love between them was no longer a sudden, desperate spark, but a slow, steady fire that warmed them both against the coming storm. The storm arrived in the form of a legal notice, delivered by a nervous deputy from town. It was a summons. The Great Western Development Company was suing Samuel Hayes for illegal occupation of their land, and they were suing the Cheyenne tribe for conspiracy and incitement of violence. The hearing was in the territorial capital in 1 month. It was a show trial designed to legally sanctify Crawford's theft. "It's a trap," Samuel said, crumpling the paper in his fist. "He wants us in his world, a courtroom, where his lies and his money mean more than the truth." "Then we must learn to speak his language," Black Kettle said, his face grim. He had arrived that morning with the news that federal agents were already on the reservation, intimidating his people, confiscating weapons. They needed a lawyer, a good one, and they needed proof. Proof that Crawford's grant was fraudulent. It was an impossible task. They had no money, no connections, and no time. Hope came from an unexpected source. The town doctor, a quiet, thoughtful man named Elias Thorne, rode out to the ranch one evening. He had treated Samuel for a broken arm years ago and had always been a fair man. "I heard about your troubles, Samuel," he said, accepting a cup of coffee, "and I heard what happened out here. Crawford is a cancer on this territory. What you two are doing, it's brave." He then told them something that changed everything. He had once treated a surveyor who had worked for Crawford's company. The man had been sick, dying, and his conscience was heavy. He'd confessed to Dr. Thorne that their initial surveys of the valley had been faked. The land grant Crawford possessed was based on fraudulent maps and falsified geological reports, deliberately omitting the existence of the Cheyenne Reservation and understating the valley's water resources to make the land seem less valuable to the government. "The surveyor gave me his logbooks," Dr. Thorne said, his eyes serious, "as proof. He made me promise to bring them to light if Crawford ever went too far. I believe that time has come." He handed Samuel a heavy leather-bound book. It was filled with drawings, measurements, and handwritten notes. It was the truth, written in ink. It was the weapon they needed. The journey to the capital was tense. Samuel, Ayanna, Black Kettle, and Dr. Thorne rode together. They were watched every step of the way. Crawford's men shadowed them, trying to intimidate them, but they never got close. It was as if the very land was protecting them. A sudden rock slide blocked a pass. A freak thunderstorm scattered their pursuers' horses. Ayanna would just smile her mysterious smile. The courtroom was packed. It was a grand, imposing room, designed to make a man feel small. Crawford was there, flanked by a team of expensive lawyers, looking smug and confident. The judge was a man known to be in Crawford's pocket. The whole thing felt like a foregone conclusion. Crawford's lawyers presented their case first. They painted Samuel as a violent squatter and the Cheyenne as bloodthirsty savages, using the armed standoff as proof of their barbarism. They presented the government grant, a document filled with official-looking stamps and signatures. It looked unbeatable. Then it was Samuel's turn. He didn't have a lawyer. He stood up and spoke for himself. He spoke simply, honestly about his 20 years on the land, about the oath he had sworn. He was followed by Black Kettle, who spoke with quiet, profound dignity about the sacred bond between his people and the land they had inhabited for centuries. The room was silent, but Samuel could feel the prejudice, the disbelief. It wasn't working. Then Dr. Thorne took the stand. He presented the surveyor's logbook. The moment the book was opened, the mood in the room shifted. Crawford's lawyers objected, but the judge, seeing the detailed maps and official-looking entries, was intrigued. He allowed it. Thorne walked the court through the surveyor's meticulous records, showing how they differed from the documents Crawford had submitted. He showed them the original survey lines, which clearly marked the reservation. He read the surveyor's notes, which detailed Crawford's orders to falsify the data. It was damning, irrefutable. When a page was shown that contained a tracing of the Great Western Development Company's official seal, a seal that hadn't even been created until 2 years after the date on the fraudulent survey, a gasp went through the courtroom. Crawford's face went white. He began shouting, calling the doctor a liar, the book a forgery. But it was too late. The truth, once revealed, could not be put back in its box. The judge, no longer able to ignore the blatant fraud, ordered Crawford and his associates be taken into custody, pending a full investigation. The courtroom erupted. Samuel and Ayanna found themselves surrounded by people, strangers, patting them on the back, shaking their hands. They had done it. They had faced the monster in his own den, and they had won. As they pushed their way through the crowd, out into the fresh air, Samuel grabbed Ayanna's hand. He pulled her away from the chaos, into a quiet alleyway. He looked at her, at the woman who had turned his entire world upside down, who had saved him from himself, who had shown him what it truly meant to be brave. "Ayanna," he said, his voice thick with emotion, when this is all over, I want to build a life with you, a real life, not as partners, not as allies." He fumbled for the words. "I want to marry you." She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, her dark eyes shining with tears. Then she smiled, the first truly joyful, unguarded smile he had ever seen from her. It lit up her whole face, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "A guardian should not have to stand alone," she repeated softly. "And a husband should always have his wife by his side." He let out a laugh, a sound of pure relief and happiness. He pulled her into his arms, right there in the dusty alley, and he held on as if he would never let go. The battle was over. The war was won, and their life was just beginning. They returned to the valley not as a soldier and a spirit talker, but as a man and a woman who had found their home. The ranch was more than just a piece of land now. It was a symbol, a place where two worlds had met, where an old promise had been honored, where a new future was being built. The veteran rancher had ridden out at dawn all those months ago, looking for his cattle. He never could have imagined what he would find instead. A purpose, a fight worth fighting, and a love that was as wild and vast and beautiful as the Wyoming sky itself. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would spend the rest of his days being thankful for the morning the silence was wrong. If you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more tales of hidden history and unlikely heroes, do me a favor. Hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. You never know what secrets are buried out there, just waiting to be uncovered.